Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are indeed very privileged to have as our guest this afternoon His Excellency David Lidington, Minister of State for Europe at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of Her Majesty the British government. We have here an opportunity to address one of the things that I think concern us who care about foreign policy the most. Europe's external strength, external strategy, the subject of today's conference, is directly, of course, related to its internal strength and cohesion. And you can never be stronger externally than you are internally. Yet the European Union has been facing a number of internal challenges as well as external challenges over the past years. How are we going to cope with them? It is clear, of course, that many of us are extremely concerned about the risk of losing the United Kingdom as a member of the European Union. And that's certainly, Mr. Minister, on everyone's minds here. But let us see what the European Union foreign policy and the challenges facing the European Union are, how they can be faced, how we can, within the scope of the emerging new way of working together, post-deal, pre-referendum, can evolve. You're very much welcome here. David Lidington, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And I will say at the start that I'm going to focus upon the external security challenges that are facing European governments. The subject is such a vast one that there are bound to be areas which interest you, on which I don't touch at all, or which I skim over very lightly. But when we get to the discussion afterwards, please feel welcome to raise any issue, whether I have focused upon that or not. And my starting point is that the first priority of any government is always the security of its citizens. And the challenges that we face now are numerous. We saw so many examples of this during 2015, whether through the ongoing horrors of the situation in Syria and the refugee crisis that caused, or the appalling terrorist outrages in Tunisia, Turkey, Paris, and more recently in Brussels, or the continued instability in eastern Ukraine. And we know that 2016 is going to be a big year in security terms. We're now less than 3 months away from the next NATO summit in Warsaw. And at some stage this year, we will also see the European Union's revised global strategy. And at the end of 2016, we're due to finish with a European Council meeting focusing upon defence. And I think this is vital at a time when the threats to our countries are growing and the world is more dangerous and uncertain today than it appeared 5 years ago. Now, while every government must choose how to spend the money that it has available, every penny of which is hard-earned by taxpayers, the United Kingdom has taken a clear decision to invest in our security and to safeguard our prosperity. And today we face both state-based threats and threats that do not recognise national borders, threats from the east and threats from the south. On the 23rd of November last year, our government published its National Security Strategy and Strategic Defence and Security Review, the SDSR. Those documents set out how we view the strategic security environment today and how we plan to meet the many challenges. The SDSR highlighted the resurgence of state-based threats, including that from Russia. It also set out our serious concerns about the increasing threat posed by terrorism, extremism, and instability embodied in the violent barbarism of Daesh. The SDSR draws out the cyber threat and makes it clear how the challenge to the rules-based international order makes it harder for all of us to tackle global security problems. Now, we're clear that these increased threats mean that we're going to need increased resources to counter them. And for that reason, the SDSR committed the United Kingdom to protecting the size of our armed forces, to developing a highly capable expeditionary force of around 50,000 by 2025, to spending £178 billion on buying and supporting equipment over the next decade, to maintaining our continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent through replacing our 4 ballistic missile submarines, to increasing cross-government spending on counter-terrorism by 30% over the next 5 years, including a significant uplift of 1,900 staff for our security and intelligence agencies, and investing just under £2 billion further to develop our capability to combat cyber threats. The SDSR also makes clear our view that economic and national security go hand in hand. You cannot divorce those two things. The UK is the only country which at the moment meets both the NATO target of spending 2% of our GDP on defence and the UN target of spending 0.7% of our gross national income on development. And alongside our world-leading armed forces and our security capability, we plan to use our outstanding global diplomatic service, our extensive aid budget, and our soft power capabilities to project our influence, promote our values, and tackle the causes of the security threats that we face and not just their consequences. The objective is to draw all the tools of national power together to deliver a full spectrum approach. The SDSR also tasked the creation of a cross-government Euro-Atlantic security policy unit that will be hosted by the Foreign Office. It will bring together diplomatic and defence expertise to develop and implement British policy on Euro-Atlantic security, NATO, and the EU's common security and defence policy. It will provide strategic direction to our Brussels delegations both in NATO and the European Union, and provide national representation to NATO and relevant EU committees. So our priorities for the next 5 years will be these. First of all, to tackle terrorism head on at home and abroad in a tough and comprehensive way. That also includes taking action to counter extremism and to challenge the poisonous ideologies that feed it. We intend to remain a world leader in cyber security and to take action to deter state-based threats. We will try to respond to crises rapidly and effectively and build resilience both at home and abroad. Second, we want to strengthen the rules-based international order and its institutions, encouraging reform to enable the further participation of growing powers. We will work with our partners to reduce conflict, promote stability, good governance, and human rights. And third, we will promote our prosperity, expanding our economic relationship with growing powers like India and China, helping to build global prosperity, investing in innovation and skills, and supporting British defence and security exports. The SDSR also recognise that Britain's safety and security depend not only on our own efforts, but on working hand in glove with our allies against common threats. we are stronger together. We must work collectively to counter the action that has undermined the rules-based international order which we have seen happening over the last few years, for example, in both Syria and in Ukraine. And in this effort, we see Sweden as a like-minded and close partner. The SDSR placed NATO firmly at the heart of UK defence policy, and it emphasised our desire to work closely with NATO allies and NATO partners, preeminently including Sweden, in the interests of security in the Euro-Atlantic space. The SDSR underlined our commitment to collective defence and continuing work to strengthen NATO's effectiveness. The government believes that NATO's partnerships with other countries make us collectively stronger in both security and in prosperity terms. And it's important that we reflect today on the threats that we face both in the East and the South. Sweden knows probably better than us the Russia that we are dealing with under President Putin today and the challenges that we faced. I think until about 3 years ago, we believed that Russia was a potential partner. Her interests were not the same as those of Western European countries, but at least they were convergent. That, after all, was why we supported the admission of Russia to the OECD, to the World Trade Organization, why we supported the expansion of the G7 to become the G8. But what we have seen with the cynical destabilization of eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea is an approach by the Kremlin which is completely at odds with any notion of partnership or of a search for integration into a rules-based international system. The annexation of Crimea in particular, I think, was a very significant moment. It represented, for the first time since the Second World War, an attempt by one European power to rewrite European borders by force. And it was the most flagrant breach of the Helsinki Final Act, of the treaties that followed the breakup of the Soviet Union, of the Budapest Memorandum that had established the arrangements for Ukraine's nuclear disarmament after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and of other international legal agreements as well. And I don't think that we can simply, in those circumstances, turn a blind eye and pretend that what has happened is something other than what we have seen. And today, when we look at Russia's attempt to dominate the affairs of its neighbours, its growing malign activities, including in and around our own countries, and its breaking of international rules, we cannot regard Russia as a strategic partner. Indeed, my judgment is that the Russian leadership has made a deliberate, conscious choice to treat Europe not as a strategic partner, but rather as a strategic adversary. The question is how we live alongside a country, Russia, which aspires under its present government to an imposed sphere of influence that is seeking to re-establish, in effect, a kind of Russian imperium over the former Soviet republics, and which also disagrees with most of the values that our country represents. And it isn't just about the shrinking pace for political and civil freedoms inside Russia itself. It's also about things like the murder in London of Alexander Litvinenko, the abduction of Eston Kova from Estonia, and most recently the ongoing detention of Nadia Savchenko and other Ukrainian citizens inside Russia. Now, of course, our immediate response to Russia is driven by its continued destabilizing actions in Ukraine. Now, we continue fully to support the Minsk process as the only viable way to resolve the crisis in eastern Ukraine. It's not perfect, but it is the only option on the table. And we've always been clear that any solution to the crisis in the Donbass has to be political, not military. I'm especially concerned at the increased levels of violence that we've seen recently in eastern Ukraine, particularly around Donetsk. The fragility of the ceasefire, the most basic part of the Minsk implementation program, underlines the importance of the European Union remaining united in its approach to ensure that Russia, which continues to be the main obstacle to full Minsk implementation, complies with its commitments. We're concerned too by the continuing support being provided by Russia to the separatists. Russia has its own obligations to fulfill under Minsk, and withdrawing this support for the separatists is part of those obligations. Russia should also use its influence over the separatists to ensure they implement their Minsk requirements by adhering fully to the ceasefire, complying with the weapons withdrawal commitments, allowing full access to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission and international humanitarian organisations, and by opening dialogue on restoring control of the border to Ukraine. Now, it's crucial for both sides, for all sides, to deliver their commitments under the Minsk agreements. But I think we've got to be very clear-eyed about where the principal blame lies for the lack of progress so far. And it's important that EU sanctions are maintained until the Minsk agreements are fully implemented. A stable and reformed Ukraine on the European Union's borders is of strategic importance for all member states. And I need hardly add, that is the solution that is sought, which has been voted for by the Ukrainian people themselves. Failure in Ukraine could lead to disastrous consequences for the Ukrainian people and for the European Union in terms of refugees, of migration, weapons proliferation, and organised crime. And I therefore think it's vital for international partners to remain committed over the long term to supporting Ukraine as it takes forward reform efforts that will be very challenging and will take a long time to accomplish in full. Now, beyond this immediate crisis over Ukraine, the UK has thought hard about how to recalibrate our strategic approach to Russia. And an important part of that is to protect our interests and the interests of our partners. NATO has taken the necessary steps to strengthen its defence and to bolster the security of our eastern allies. Britain has been a leading contributor to that NATO effort, and Royal Air Force Typhoon jets and the Royal Navy warship HMS Iron Duke are deploying to the Baltic this month as part of the UK's commitment to Eastern European allies. And I think more needs to be done. The Warsaw Summit should take the next step to enhance NATO's deterrence and make NATO adaptable to all of today's security threats. Russia's major military investment, including in its nuclear forces, its increased activity around the territory of NATO allies, and the unpredictable actions of its leadership, means we can't afford to be complacent. Deterrence and engagement are complementary parts of protecting security. Only by engaging in both will we address the full scale of the challenge that Russia presents to us. I'm sure everyone here knows that today NATO is talking to Russia in the context of the NATO-Russia Council. And it is important to understand each other and to reduce the risks of military incident. But at the same time, we have to be clear that this is not a return to business in usual. It is a business as usual. It is contact which is in our interests and on our terms and with a carefully chosen agenda. Now, though not a NATO member of the alliance, Sweden's partnership with the alliance is an important part of ensuring a coherent European response to external threats, including from Russia. And as NATO is at the centre of the UK's defence and security, we appreciate Sweden's role as one of NATO's closest and active partners. It's right that it is one of the alliance's enhanced opportunities partners, and we support deepening that relationship further. Now, Russia's actions in and around Ukraine demonstrated the application of hybrid tactics, utilising all levers of power designed to weaken a potential target through a synchronised application of pressure over time. Ambiguity that makes decision-making complicated, exploiting weakness and undermining both political cohesion and the legitimacy of any course of action. And Russia has a complete set of tools and levers available to it across the full spectrum, from conventional diplomacy to economics to military force to information to cyber capacity. And while the use of a variety of tools in pursuit of a political objective is not new, it is the willingness and apparent ability of Russia to rapidly coordinate its activity that has caused so much concern since the events in Crimea. European states must ensure that they invest appropriately to protect themselves nationally, both in terms of defence spending, but also in terms of reducing their vulnerability and building resilience to the hybrid threat. Now, there's a role here both for the EU and for NATO. And the broad spectrum of tools which those two organisations cover between them requires the more effective coordination of actions to respond to the challenge of hybrid tactics. We also need to constrain malign Russian influence in Europe and the wider neighbourhood. As part of that, the UK supports action to reduce the European Union's dependence on imports of Russian gas and to drive the completion of the single European energy market. Europe should also continue to support reforms in the eastern neighbourhood. The Riga summit underlined that Europe has an important role in supporting the sovereign choices made by Eastern Partnership states. We should continue to work bilaterally and through the partnership's multilateral platforms to enhance the resilience and increase the prosperity of our Eastern partners. That means focusing on providing visible support for reform programmes that will deliver noticeable results on the ground. It's going to be difficult work for the governments of these Eastern European countries to deliver reforms. It means taking on important vested interests. It means, for example, when we look at the provisional application of free trade agreement provisions, requiring rather old-fashioned domestic producers to meet the standards that are required if you're to sell into European markets. So assistance, particularly technical assistance, in enabling those Eastern partners to make that transition so that they can show positive results to their own people is, to my mind, an essential ingredient of an effective programme of support. At the same time, firm adherence to conditionality and good strategic communications are absolutely vital. And in response to Russian propaganda efforts, we've launched a Russian language strategic communications programme to constrain Russia's ability to use disinformation as a tool of hybrid warfare. This program aims to bring plurality and balance to Russian language media and help Russian-speaking communities to become more critical consumers of media output and have access to balanced and objective reporting. So in its first year, this program is funding people-to-people outreach in the Baltic states, aimed in particular at engaging with Russian speakers. It's funding support for independent and public Russian language media in the Baltic states, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And it's supporting the European Endowment for Democracy's Russian language media initiatives, including the establishment of a pan-regional Russian language production hub. Separately from this, and in parallel, the BBC will independently expand its Russian language services. Starting in 2016-17, the BBC will increase news gathering across the former Soviet Union, produce daily 30-minute Russian language news bulletins, increase local partnerships, and provide an online platform for news and for multi-genre entertainment. The UK is clear that the West should not normalise relations with Russia while it continues to destabilise Ukraine. But we do have to get the balance right. We should not isolate Russia. That would be dangerous. And it would reduce the options for cooperation on those limited subjects where we do need to try to work together. And where we should engage is where it suits our interests. And that includes on key international issues like Syria and Iran, where Russia plays a role. And it's also important to engage with Russia in ways that reduce the risk of a military misjudgment with potentially catastrophic and escalatory consequences. Finally, we do need to remain true to our values and to the rule of law. So in our bilateral relationships with Russia and through multilateral organisations, we do continue to prioritise the promotion and protection of human rights. We make our concerns clear to Russia and aim to deliver and support projects that will improve the situation on the ground. We should find ways to try to keep civil society in Russia alive against rapidly reducing odds and continue to support wider links between our people to keep open the prospect for better relations in the future. And while we won't lose sight of the threat from the east, we must also provide assurance in Europe's southern neighbourhood. Let me start with Libya. Peace in Libya is crucial for stability in the wider North Africa and Mediterranean regions. We need a capable government in place to stop the trade in illegal migrants, to counter Daesh's increasing foothold in that country, and to reduce the quantity of weapons in circulation. And the UK, working with international partners, is wholeheartedly committed to supporting the newly established Government of National Accord. Bilaterally, we'll be allocating £10 million in this financial year to help the new government restore stability in Libya, rebuild the economy, fight Daesh, and tackle the criminal gangs that exploit illegal migrants. And we're pulling together international efforts to support the new Libyan government. Now, EU efforts need to have the buy-in of the Government of National Accord and reflect its priorities, as well as being integrated with others. Policing, security sector reform, rule of law, and border management are areas where the EU could add value. And I was pleased that on Monday evening at the Foreign Affairs Council, after a video conference with Prime Minister Serraj of Libya, that European foreign ministers were able to agree on conclusions that opened the door to consider such things as a CSDP mission, such things as support for strengthening Libya's Coast Guard service in response to requests from the new Libyan authorities. Secondly, migration. The The UK is actively taking part in the EU's counter-migration operation in Libya and in the central Mediterranean alongside Sweden. Operation Sapphire, as it is known, has had some success at identifying suspected smugglers operating in international waters and has certainly prevented a great loss of life. And like Sweden, the UK is playing a leading role in tackling the refugee crisis. We're working upstream to tackle irregular migration across the Mediterranean. This includes £4 billion in aid for Africa last financial year, refocused on jobs and livelihoods, trying to give people a reason for hope in their own countries of origin. At the Valletta summit, we announced a further £200 million in bilateral aid to Africa to tackle the root causes of migration, and we've committed £50 million to fund the Organised Immigration Crime Task Force up to 2020, a task force that has officers deployed in the UK, Europe and Africa. We've also been at the forefront of the humanitarian response in Syria and the region. On the 4th of February this year, we co-hosted the Supporting Syria and the Region conference in London that raised more than €12 billion, the largest amount ever raised in one day in response to a humanitarian disaster. The conference signalled a new approach by the international community in dealing with protracted crises involving large numbers of displaced people. This approach will help people stay and build livelihoods in safe regions near to their homes. They'll be provided with employment and education opportunities and be in a position to return home once it is safe for them to do so, and to return home equipped with the relevant skills to help rebuild their country and make a successful life there. The UK has pledged £2.3 billion in humanitarian assistance to support Syrian refugees. This is our largest ever response to a humanitarian crisis, and we will resettle 20,000 vulnerable Syrian refugees from camps in the region over the lifetime of this Parliament. In addition, we're providing up to £65 million humanitarian assistance in Europe, Turkey and North Africa as part of the crisis response. We're the largest bilateral contributor. We strongly support the recently agreed EU-Turkey agreement on migration. We think it's already making a genuine difference to the migration flows into Europe. The evidence, the figures are showing a significant reduction in the number of arrivals in Greece in April compared with the equivalent period a month ago. And that agreement disrupts the smugglers' business model by breaking the link between getting in a boat and settling in Europe. We welcome too NATO's maritime mission to conduct reconnaissance and surveillance of illegal crossings in the Aegean. NATO is performing an important role in providing national Coast Guard services and the EU's Frontex with information to intercept illegal people smuggling. And let's not forget that 9 out of 10 people arriving in Greece, having crossed the Aegean, say that they have been taken there by people smugglers. Third, action to counter Daesh. Europe is facing a deeply worrying and still evolving threat from Daesh-linked and Daesh-inspired terrorism. The recent attacks have been a very harsh reminder that it is vital that European countries, both governments and police and security and intelligence agencies, work together to combat this threat and keep citizens safe. We see the sharing of information, particularly among security and intelligence services, as a top priority. And we have specific technical expertise that we have offered to share. We must also increase our efforts and upgrade our capability to respond to and to outpace the extremist propaganda that is used to groom and radicalize individuals. Europe also needs to focus on delivering effective de-radicalization and disengagement programs for those who have been radicalized. And this has to go hand in hand with work to defeat Daesh in Syria and Iraq and the wider region. Now, as a leading member of the global coalition to defeat Daesh, and Sweden, of course, is a contributor to this too, we are attacking Daesh militarily, we're squeezing its finances, we're disrupting the flow of fighters to its cause and challenging its poisonous ideology. Daesh has lost about 40% of the populated areas it once controlled in Iraq and significant territory in Syria. Thousands of people have been freed from their rule and have been able to return safely to their homes. And Britain's been playing a major role. We've flown over 2,200 missions, conducted more than 700 strikes, and provided niche and highly advanced intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assistance in support of the coalition effort. We've established an anti-Daesh coalition communications cell embedded in the Foreign Office in London to combat and undermine Daesh's brand and ensure no communication space is left uncontested. But we're clear that defeating Daesh requires transition in Syria and political progress in Iraq. The UK is working on all fronts in Syria, politically, militarily, and on humanitarian and stabilisation work. To support negotiations, and for its own sake, as a matter of principle, it is vital that all parties continue to uphold the cessation of hostilities and allow sustained humanitarian access to those who are in need. And it was both encouraging but at the same time worrying on Monday to hear the UN High Commissioner for Refugees saying that while the UNHCR was now getting access to more of the besieged areas inside Syria than a few months ago, they were still getting access to only a minority of those areas inside Syrian territory. And we must not lose sight of the fact that only a genuine political transition away from Assad to a government that can represent all Syrians can bring about an enduring peace and the defeat of Daesh. I simply do not believe that after all the blood that has been shed in the last few years, the barrel bombs in Aleppo and so on, that Assad is going to be able to be the focus of any kind of national unity and reconstruction in the future. So let me conclude, both by reiterating the scale of the challenges we face, but also my confidence that collectively we can take the necessary steps to meet them. We're working in partnership to strengthen NATO and to improve the EU's effectiveness and its complementary role in security. And as our strategic defence and security review makes clear, my country is taking these responsibilities seriously, supporting regional security through our efforts in NATO, but also taking a global perspective on the multitude of challenges we face. I think the SDSR demonstrates our commitment to security and prosperity, not just for the UK alone, but for Europe as a whole and for the wider world. Now, history tells us that no government can predict the future. We've no way of knowing precisely what course events will take over the next 5 years. To the risk of a cliche, we must expect the unexpected. But we can make sure that we have the versatility and the means to respond to new risks and new threats to our security as they arise. And we in London shall certainly continue to regard Sweden as a key partner in that work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Lidington, for this review of the three major challenges on Russia relations, on migration, and on the Daesh-Syrian situation, and your setting of this within the context of your strategic defense strategy review, something that certainly we in Sweden are reflecting on as well. But where do we stand as a partnership in Europe? To comment on this, I have invited Björn Fägersten, who is Director of European Issues at the Centre, and Therese Larsson Hultin, who is Senior Foreign Analyst at Svenska Dagbladet. I invite you both to come up and perhaps each give some reflections after your speech, and then we'll have a little exchange, and then we'll invite the audience as well. We agreed, Björn, that you go first, so over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister, for your speech and your thorough presentation here. I'll try to give a short Swedish perspective on the British perspective on Europe's external challenges. And of course, unavoidably, the primary perspective right now is that the British perspective might soon be an external challenge to Europe, or at least to the European Union. And even if we keep within the theme today and discuss foreign policy and Europe's external challenges, the scenario when we will not have the UK within the European Union has a huge impact on this issue, especially from a Swedish perspective. First of all, I mean, I think you could assume that Europe would be slightly more willing, but definitely less able when it comes, as a collective, when it comes to foreign policy without the UK. I mean, we've heard a very impressive presentation, both of the kind of global scope of the UK, but also when it comes to resources. We've heard about intelligence sharing, the diplomatic network, etc. you have at your disposal, and to some extent to the disposal of other European partners. I think that is something that worries Sweden very much now, also focusing on European affairs. Also, what kind of EU foreign policy would we see without the UK and their perspective? Would it be a more French foreign policy, perhaps Germany taking care of internal integration in Europe, France steering the foreign policy? Sweden would, that would be not a dream situation for Sweden for sure. I also think you discussed about NATO quite a lot and the interaction between EU and NATO. And almost as a paradox, this is also vital from a Swedish perspective, because we do not want the European Union to develop a very strong defense capability or identity, and that is something that, well, UK has helped us with. But UK has also been kind of a bridge between EU and NATO, and that is also in Sweden's interest. Since we're not in NATO, we at least want NATO to work closely with the EU. So both of these perspectives is something that the UK help us with, and which we might lose in case of a Brexit. Also, when we discussed Russia, for example, it's pretty clear the role of the UK, but I would also name other areas like Burma, for example. The sanctions there is something that is very much, or at least thanks to the UK. So there's lots to lose from a Swedish perspective also in this field, and I haven't even started on the Eurozone and the life in the EU periphery, the internal stuff, if you choose to leave. We also have the soft power, the attraction. Before we met today, before our meeting, I was at a meeting with the students from the European, from the Eastern Partnership, and they asked me, for example, one of the questions was like, how can we feel any enthusiasm for this partnership we're in and what you're offering us if you don't have any enthusiasm for your union within the EU? What are we really striving for? And I think that's really at the heart of this question, also the kind of the more soft issues, consequences of the EU debate right now. But I know that this is not your scenario, Minister, of a Brexit, so I won't ask any questions on that specific topic. I will, however, ask about your renegotiation and what it means also for this area, because foreign policy is not only costly when it comes to material issues. The issue, for example, of sanctions is really down to solidarity, because some countries will bear more of a cost than others. So I wonder, and within the EU today, the basic kind of vehicle or the process of gaining solidarity is and have been the notion of an ever closer union, not necessarily between member states, but between the people of Europe. So I wonder, when one country is going to be accepted from this notion, also in the most fundamental of treaties, what could be the long-term effects of this if this is not a common objective, an ever closer union, especially also when it comes to foreign policy and the solidarity that you need for this policy field? Finally, I'm curious about the strategy for Europe. We've heard about your internal strategy and the way it tries to, you say it brings together all the tools of national power. And that is something, of course, every member state tries with. We're having the same process in Sweden right now. But the EU is also in this process in the foreign policy area, trying to create a global strategy with the aim of bringing together the tools and use them more effectively. There was supposed to be a decision on this strategy on the June 23rd, but now something else happened on that day. So they've postponed the decision or the discussions. But I wonder, from a UK perspective, and also having finished your own strategy, what would your input be to this European process of a common foreign policy strategy? Can we learn from the British experience, and what do you expect from a strategy, a European strategy in this field? What are your hopes, your ambitions? That would be my comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Björn. We can give Björn an applause too. We'll soon give the minister also an applause, because we're not going to let him so easily off the hook on Brexit as we tried to give him a chance to do, Björn. But Therese, maybe you'll pick up that or some other aspects of the minister's presentation. Over to you.
Well, I would just like to start with by saying that I was so happy when 2015. Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I was so happy when 2015 was over, because it was such a depressive year. And I had the feeling of 2016, new year, new beginning, and then bam, everything just goes on, and it's just as worse as last year. I thought it was interesting, Minister, when you talked about the safe regions and the refugees near to their homes, and that was the way to go forward. I was in Lebanon a few weeks ago. Lebanon is a country of 4.4 million people. They have received 1.5 million Syrian refugees so far. That's the official number. The unofficial number is probably a lot higher. Some people talk about 2 million, 3 million. I think that's too high, but at least it's a high number. 1/3 of the population in Lebanon right now is a refugee. This put on a lot of strains, a lot of water consumption, electricity, food, and so on and so forth. They have 500,000 kids who need to go to school. The schools in Lebanon work double shifts to accommodate all these kids. I think this is a perfect growing environment for what you also talked about, extremism and fighting radicalization. And I would like you to develop a little bit more about how this is the place where it's better to keep these people and what we can do to help them. Lebanon has asked for $2.5 billion in support to handle the situation. But I thought that those thoughts were interesting. I also appreciated the fact that you were so clear on Russia. I thought that was a bit of a new tone, not from you particularly, but I think it's interesting how everyone is now dare to talk freely about Putin and what's going on in Russia. But you said that what we need is a political solution, and then you started talking about NATO and then beefing up the military. So I would also like to develop a little bit more what political solutions we could see. More sanctions, or what could we do, or what could you do? Because the sanctions that we have seen has not worked so far. It's not, at least not that I'm aware of. I also thought it was interesting that you talked about Assad and that you were very clear that Assad needs to go. Because it seems like in the past few years, as ISIS or Daesh has risen, Assad has gone from being the bad guy to not the good guy, but at least not so bad guy anymore. And how do you see that change coming about? What can be done and what should we do in the Western world to make sure that we see a new government in Syria?
Thank you very much. Minister, would you like to pick up some of those comments?
Sure. I mean, all of them deserve a sort of day's seminar in their own right.
You can pick and choose, and then we'll turn to the audience, and you can avoid the difficult ones.
Take it as read that I am an absolutely committed supporter of David Cameron in seeking to get a decisive vote for continued British membership of the EU on the 23rd of June. And for Björn, you mentioned a couple of items where we contributed, and I could point to how we're hosting Operation Atalanta out of HMS Northwood, to the role that the UK played in the European work on Iran, in getting a sanctions package together that was stronger than either the Americans or the Iranians had expected, and then in working very closely together on the negotiations that led to the deal last year, to what we've put into the Balkans, where we have been active both in support of the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, but also in Bosnia-Herzegovina as well, in working particularly with Germany there to re-energize the political process. Burma, you mentioned, on Ukraine, where I know for a fact that David Cameron has been absolutely instrumental in ensuring that the EU and the US positions on sanctions have been kept very closely aligned. So on the February European Council outcome, I think, it's for other governments in Europe to decide what they think about ever closer union. I note that the principle was established as far back as the June European Council conclusions in 2014, that phrase ever closer union meant different things to different member states. And what was agreed in February this year was not only a specific change to the European treaties next time they're revised to make it clear that those words about ever closer union do not bind the United Kingdom, but in those February conclusions there was a passage which said that not just for the UK but for everybody, the phrases about ever closer union cannot be used to justify sort of political integration or specific legislative initiatives towards further political integration. And I think it's a serious challenge for Europe here, because you look at the findings in Pew Research or Eurobarometer. The notion that discontent with how the EU operates is a British problem alone is for the birds. I've seen polls that have shown disaffection greater in France and Spain than in the UK. I look around at election results in the rest of Europe, or opinion polls in the rest of Europe. You know your own position here. It's changed a bit, but 2 years ago, would I have expected the Sweden Democrats to be topping an opinion poll in this country? No. Jobbik has been on the rise. We've seen a populist party of the left come to power in Greece. We have seen a surge of support for, again, broadly left insurgent movements in Italy and Spain. We are seeing Marine Le Pen as a contender to get into the second round of the presidential election next year. Even in Germany, we're seeing Alternative, getting comfortably above the threshold for entry into the federal parliament next year, is not just to land parliaments. So there's a European phenomenon here. I can remember Carl Bildt saying to me, about 18 months ago, said, David, you have to tell Nigel Farage that he is part of a European phenomenon. And I think, he was actually right about that. So there's a big question for the EU as a whole. How do you reconnect with people? And it's not just a discontent with Europe, it's a discontent with government, with conventional politics. There's a frustration by a lot of people that globalization is putting them at risk. It's the same thing that's driving Trump's support in the United States, and to some extent Sanders' support there as well. And part of the answer is actually Europe accepting that you've got to respect the fact that different countries are going to operate in different ways. And people want some certainty and familiarity with how they live their lives. And I think the key thing that came out of February was acceptance of that principle. We're not talking any longer about Europe of two speeds. We're talking about a Europe where different destinations can be accommodated within the terms of reference of the Union. And I think that was a very important principle. And I think it reflects the reality in particular that you've got a number of countries that have committed themselves to a currency union. That is going to drive the need for further fiscal and economic integration. And in my view, it will require a measure of political integration as well, because there needs to be a way of holding such decisions democratically accountable at Eurozone level. And so the EU is going to have to face up to the question of how do we operate as a union of 28 when 19 of us who constitute a qualified majority in the Council have created this dynamic for further integration and faster integration amongst ourselves. What does that mean? How do you relate the Europe of 28 to the Europe of 19, and particularly for single market measures and financial services measures? That is of key significance, which is why that element of the February Council deal was of such importance for us. What do we expect for the European security strategy? Let me come to that in answering Therese, actually, because it fits into what I want to say a bit there. How do we deal with people in the region? I mean, you're absolutely right about Lebanon. I could add Jordan as well, that another small country facing huge strains, having already, of course, taken on board over decades huge numbers of Palestinian refugees. And let's not forget what prompted the flow across the Aegean last summer was that people were not delivering on their promises of humanitarian assistance, so the UN had to cut the food rations and cut the schooling hours in the camps in Turkey. So more people despaired and threw themselves at the mercy of the people smugglers. So it means we have to pay a lot of money. And if more of our partners followed a Swedish and British example and spent the 0.7% of GNI, it's the UN target on development, then we will be closer to doing that. But it means that we're going to have to be more generous in our support, and it means we're going to have to be hard-headed about what we need to do in terms of the so-called upstream work over the long term. And that means, I'm saying to some of our partners, look, I know you are unhappy with trade liberalisation to, let us say, North African or West African countries, but if you're not going to accept their fruit and vegetables, you're going to have a lot of their people trying to get to. I mean, that, it's putting it in slightly bold language, but there is a truth there, because you're looking at a long-term issue. This is not a problem that will go away in a year. Look at the demographics of Africa or much of Asia. 60% of the population in most of these countries is under 30. Even the more successful ones are not generating anything like enough jobs to satisfy the ambitions of those young people. Add to that the fact that all of them now, people have got the smartphones, that the people traffickers are immensely professional criminal international businesses. They publish travel advice in the way foreign ministries do. I'm serious. Greece, it goes up the coast. Greece, get to Greece. Hungary's closed its border. Go to this town, move west along this road and try Croatia instead. And they update it. They post online the mobile numbers for the people to get further advice. There is a system whereby the smugglers get people these phones, get their phones charged. These are ruthless, well-organised, professional criminal networks. They're not fly-by-night gangs. And this challenge of large-scale migration pressures, which are going to be driven by demographics, lack of economic opportunity, climate change, are going to be with us for a long time. So we have to think strategic. That means using, yes, development aid and strengthening governance and CSDP and all that, but also means trade access. Because trade is going to always does provide greater wealth than even the best designed aid program. I think the other thing, Therese, this is tough message, but we have to be very clear in the context I've described, a more generous approach upstream, to a policy of returns. I mean, the UK does have a lot of experience of returning people to countries like Pakistan. You have a higher success rate than other European governments. It does require sustained political relationships with those countries. But we have to say to people, sorry, but understand why don't blame you in a sense for trying to come here to get a better life, but we cannot provide a home for everybody who wishes to come. So if you come, you will be returned. It was very noticeable that when the Balkan countries made it clear, and Austria and Germany, they were not accepting people from Morocco and Algeria, the people from Morocco and Algeria stopped going to Turkey and trying to take the Aegean route. The numbers fell back quite dramatically because those criminal networks telegraphed the information back very rapidly indeed. Political answers on Ukraine. You give us all the easy, the easy answers. No quick and easy one, but the key element here is to strengthen the reform process in Ukraine itself. Now, we need willing and effective partners for that, and Ukrainian politics has been pretty difficult recently, but it seems to me that is the absolute key, and to show persistence over sanctions. Putin is telling the oligarchs, just hold on a bit, Europe's going to give up anytime soon. He's been telling the oligarchs for a year, by the summer of 2016, it'll all be over.
But persistence or increasing sanctions?
It should be, the sanctions should be calibrated to what Russia does. So, and it's important that we do maintain unity over this, both within Europe and with the US. So I would keep sanctions where they are for now, but if Russia were to go further, if we were going to get the Novorossiya project were to resurface, you had a grab on Kherson or Kharkov or somewhere, then yes, you should certainly be straight back to looking at further additional sanctions. And on Assad, again, there's no overnight answer to that. And it's Moscow and Tehran are the people who are able to strong-arm Assad. I think my own view is that Russia has no sentimental attachment to Assad, personally, but they want to demonstrate that they stand by their mates, that they're protecting their military and intelligence interests in the region, and that a government of national unity should be a fig leaf one, if he's given his dacha and Sochi in a year's time, but they want to sort of do it on their terms, so it's not genuinely broad-based. I think it's going to have to be a very decentralised sort of Syria if it's going to work, just because of what's happened. The different groups are not going to trust each other in any short space of time. But I just think we have to persist with the Geneva process in terms of Syria. There isn't an easy answer to that. Quickly wrap all this. I haven't answered the question about security strategy. Comprehensive approach. We talk about a comprehensive approach all the time in the EU. How often does it actually happen? How often do you get the Action Service and the Commission genuinely working together rather than having a turf war with one another? I'm being a bit undiplomatic here, but I mean, this happens too often. And so it needs to be a genuine comprehensive approach. It needs to be one that complements NATO and other organisations and doesn't seek to duplicate everything. So on hybrid, energy, cyber, there are areas where the EU can and should play a role. And we should focus on the neighbourhood, east and south, and then on the threats that come through the neighbourhood, which are through the form of terrorism, etc., that I've described. Those have to be the priorities. If we can't get the neighbourhood right, then we shouldn't try and play God in the rest of the world.
Thank you, Minister. Well, you have argued quite lucidly for the need of a comprehensive strategy, yet our own polities are fragmenting and it's difficult to keep them together. So there you go, that's the difficulty. Who would like to pick up the dialogue here and put a few questions? There's one right there.
My name is Hormus.
Briefly, please, and yes, thank you.
My name is Hormus Kapadia, British citizen since a long time in Sweden. A question to you, David, as one of your former constituents in Aylesbury. I remember you as a young MP in 1992.
My goodness.
We both had hair of a different colour then.
Yes, absolutely. My brother still lives there. Anyway, my question is, we have a lot of things in common, Sweden and Britain.
Yeah.
Our monetary system and things. One of the reasons that we have been in Sweden for so long is that we find Sweden very like Great Britain to live in. And there are 20,000 Brits living in Sweden. Why don't you make it easier for us to remain in the EU by giving us the vote? I know I've been asked by all my Swedish friends, you're going to vote to remain. I said, sorry, I'm not,
you have
because I don't have a vote.
Fix that. Thanks very much. Over here.
Minister, you are expecting President Obama this Friday in the UK? Thank you. You are expecting the visit of President Obama this Friday about your relation, the Euro-Atlantic, or particularly your personal relationship.
Can you please put the mic, if you hold it up like that?
Yes, I am saying that President Obama is visiting the UK on Friday. What are your expectations? Because you have elaborately described to us your relationship, and your agenda is very much linked to the US. And for the prospect of a Brexit, maybe this agenda might be perturbed. And also, we have seen that the US has not been very keen on acting on Ukraine, except for sanctions. If it wanted really to act, it would have maybe involved NATO. But this was not the case, because the US wanted to avoid any bigger conflict with Russia. So please, thank you.
Thank you. One over here, please.
Thank you. Anke Schmidt-Veldsman, Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I wanted to point the view to the Baltic Sea region, and you mentioned also that, well, you have your submarines, nuclear submarines, and there is a strong interest also in security and defense. So if you could say a few more words about what the United Kingdom is actually doing in and for the Baltic Sea region in terms of security, and regarding also Finland and Sweden, but of course also Baltic states and Poland, and the issue of Kaliningrad. And the second issue that is related to that, you made a point about the dependence on Russian natural gas, and I would like to hear a few more words on the UK view on the energy union, and specifically the Nord Stream project, because Shell is of course also a shareholder in the project for the third and fourth pipelines. Thank you.
Is that an agenda? that you can address,
Right.
sir?
Okay, let's run through those in turn. It's funny where I meet sort of people, refugees from Aylesbury. You know, I mean, the answer is that, of course, anybody who has been living abroad for up to 15 years can register to vote, and it is now very easy to vote, to register online on the gov.uk website, and where our embassies are trying to publicise that through to expatriate communities abroad. To go above the 15 years does require primary legislation. It needs a new Act of Parliament, and it also needs some quite tricky technical questions answered, because we rely for our elections on a single member constituency system for Parliament, not on regional lists. You have got to be allocated to a particular address to vote. And if you're talking about somebody, you know, it's up to 15 years, well, you know, where you were last registered. Our local authorities do not keep electoral registers that are older than 15 years. So somebody comes, well, I've been away for 20 years. We've got to have a mechanism for being able to verify which place they should be living in, because you could say it's an academic risk, but if you're looking at a parliamentary seat where the margin of votes is very small between different parties, you know, you don't want even the suspicion that people are being recruited in other parts of the world to claim a false relationship with an area with no means of verifying that. So but we've got a commitment in our manifesto to legislate for this, but I've got to be straight with you. I mean, that is not going to happen ahead of the referendum, but we will have done that before the end of this Parliament. So the next general election, you should be fine. On Obama, well, the chief reason for Obama coming over is that he can have tea with the Queen and wish her well for her 90th birthday. So this is in part. I mean, they get on very well, the two of them, and so he wanted to come and say goodbye to the Queen before the end of his presidency. He will, I rather suspect, be asked about his views on the referendum, and I would think it perfectly reasonable for the President of the United States to say that he respects, you know, the fact it's a decision for the British people, but that he will explain what it is what it means for the United States and the United States' interests and the interests of the West as a whole. Now, that's up to him. I don't know what he would say, but I suspect he'll be asked about it. And on other matters, I mean, when he sees the Prime Minister, I'm pretty certain that Russia, Ukraine, counter-terrorism, Daesh are going to come up. I mean, Russia. I mean, she's not. I mean, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and so I think there is a big difference of principle that explains why it's not NATO that's taken the lead in responding to the Ukraine crisis. But I think that there is a longer-term question about Europe and America, which we need to have in mind, which is we see in the presidential campaign that there is more of an isolationist sort of trend in US politics and public opinion at the moment. And add to that the US focus on China and on the Pacific region. And I think what it means is that over this side of the Atlantic, we can't simply take it for granted that America will always be the one to ride in and take charge. I think there's an expectation in Washington that European countries make more of an effort to deal with their own neighbourhood. And that reinforces, in my view, it reinforces the case for continued British membership of the EU, but it also reinforces the need for the sort of comprehensive approach that I've described. It's difficult to thrash out because, rightly, we require unanimity. I wouldn't change that. But Iran showed it can be done. And it needs hard work and application to the habit of working together. On the Baltics, we've contributed to the Baltic air policing mission. We have taken part in the increased pace of NATO exercises in the Baltic region, and we have sent in more British troops to take part in the sort of swifter roulement of NATO forces in the Baltic states. I mean, there's been this argument about permanent NATO bases. I don't think we should get trapped in a sort of Cold War model of thinking that the answer is huge, NATO establishments, the sort that we or the Americans used to have in northern Germany. But the idea that we have pushed of a persistent NATO presence, so that there's a constant flow of NATO units going in and out of the Baltic states, I think helps to provide that the deterrence and the reassurance that the governments of those three countries need, and we need to back that up with solid political reassurance as well. On energy union, there'll be debate about some of the details of this, but broadly speaking, we support the energy union work. We thought the Sefcovic paper was a very good first step forward. And on Nord Stream, exactly the same rules should apply to South Stream. This needs to be fully compliant with EU law. If that means unbundling, then that means unbundling. There shouldn't be any sorts of special favours for a Nord Stream project, and we shouldn't have any illusions about the fact that this is seen in Moscow as something rather more than just a commercial effort.
Thank you. We have just time for a few more questions around, and then I'll turn back to Therese and Björn, and then I'll give the Minister the last word.
Minister, my name is Tatiana Caldas from Eversheds International, a British law firm here in Stockholm. And my question is regarding the approach or keeping friendly relationship with Russia. Is there unity among the EU members states regarding having that approach, and for how long? Is it a mid-term, long-term relationship? Keeping it friendly, at the same time there are sanctions? That's my question. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to? Then Therese?
Well, I have a question about Brexit that we've hardly touched upon at all. But before I ask you that question, I would like to know what Nigel Farage said when you told him that he was part of the European movement, which I hope you did, by the way. Anyhow, when it comes to Brexit, one of the things that has been said in Scotland is that if the English then vote to leave the European Union, we, the Scots, will vote to leave the UK. But this hasn't really been played up that much in the English papers. Why do you think that is? And what do you see happening there when it comes to Scotland?
Okay. I think, Minister, we will want a little bit more on the Brexit issues. We're dying to understand how you will make sure to stay.
I have one final question on Europe, which for me summarizes both the questions here and your speech. It's pretty clear that I don't think there's ever been such an evident demand for cooperation in Europe on the different challenges we see. At the same time, as a paradox, I don't think there's ever been such a fierce resistance in not only the UK, as you said, but in other member states. So how do you, as a politician, kind of square this problem? What is the solution out of this paradox?
The core of the issue. Let's have the answer, Minister.
Do start with Nigel Farage.
We're so happy that you are here.
I'm going to do with Sofiana first. I mean, the answer is there have been different views have been brought to the council meetings by different governments, but the council meetings have all finished with a common position. So we've managed to sustain unity. It's not always been easy, but it has been done, and I think it was the territorial annexation, that upsetting of the Helsinki order that persuaded even relatively reluctant governments that you simply could not pretend that you could revert to business as usual. But I do think it's important that we we stick to the course. I mean, to go to Therese and Björn. No, I'm afraid. No, Nigel Farage and I don't often take tea together. So I mean, I've sort of not had that opportunity. Scotland will vote overwhelmingly. At the moment, the poll's saying over 60% to stay. The Scottish First Minister has said that she would use a UK decision to leave, coupled with a Scottish vote to stay, as the trigger to try to push for a second referendum. So I think it would be destabilising. I think they would also have a vote to leave would have a destabilising effect on Northern Ireland as well. And I have found that talking both to nationalist and to unionist politicians in Ireland. I know it's something that worries the Irish government in Dublin a great deal. I mean, I can sort of wrap up the points about where does Europe go from Björn and sort of the Brexit arguments. The arguments that we have to make in Britain have to be pragmatic. I think that, I think Swedes will understand this, but there is not, and there is never likely to be, a sort of emotional commitment to the ideal of European integration in the UK in the way that you find in Germany or you find in much of continental Europe. The geography obviously is different, but the historical experience in the mid-20th century was so different. For most of Europe, the mid-20th century demonstrated how national institutions, national identity, national solidarity was not enough to prevent catastrophe. War, massacre, dictatorship, ethnic cleansing, even after 45, a couple of years of where much of Europe was an ungoverned space with millions of refugees. That experience was devastating. For us, the same period was about the triumph of national solidarity and national institutions. It's what held us together and enabled us to stand up to Nazism. So the national mythologies are completely different. And that has a very powerful sort of cultural impact on how people think about Europe. So the arguments to work in the UK have to be, in essence, pragmatic ones. And yes, some of it can be political. I will certainly go and argue that enlargement has brought political stability and the rule of law to Central Europe, whereas after World War I, when that experiment was tried, it all fell apart within 25 years, and that EU accession is the reason for this, and that is in British interests, to have a stable Central Europe, just as it is now to have a stable Balkans. But the prime arguments will be economic, and it's about foreign direct investment into the UK, the lion's share of everything going into the EU. It's about the fact that 44% of our trade is with the EU, about the fact that EU membership gives you significantly greater leverage in global trade negotiations than you would ever get on your own. So all those arguments need to be brought into play, coupled with a hard-headed description of the risks involved in pulling out. Because what is striking about the Leave campaign is that they refuse to come up with a coherent account of what out looks like. Some say Norway, some say Switzerland, some say... One dissenting minister came up with Albania yesterday as the model, which was an interesting one. Boris Johnson went through, I think, 4 different positions in as many weeks. So there is, what is clear is that none of those options give us as much as we have through full membership. And in essence, the full membership means we can help lead the work in making the rules, rather than just having to accept rules that are made by others, and made by others when you've taken away from the table the biggest champion of open markets and free trade in Europe, and which is therefore almost inevitably going to be a bit more protectionist and inward-looking than it is now. Not in our interests. And we'll make that argument very strongly. To come to your point then about where does Europe go from here, Europe has to show two things. It has to show, first of all, that it's delivering economically for people. Now, there's a hell of a lot that rests on national governments to do. This cannot all be done, or principally be done at EU level. But there are things that the EU should be doing, and in fairness, Juncker and Timmermans are now working very hard to do to try and generate jobs. Because if we don't make Europe more competitive, and we have anything like current levels of youth unemployment in so much of Europe in 5 or 10 years' time as we do today, then the move towards the Le Pens and the Jobbiks is going to be far greater then than it is even now. If the next generation can't afford the living standards or the social protection or the public services their parents have today, the social and political consequences will be profound. And that means completing the single market. It means getting on with services liberalisation, because services is where the new jobs and growth come from. It means really pushing forward with free trade agreements, because that is what is going to enable us to take advantage not just of cheaper costs in dealing with developed economies like the US and Canada, but of actually selling more freely to those tens of millions of middle-class consumers in the emerging economies, in Latin America and in Asia. And we've got to cut unnecessary red tape at European as well as at national level that holds back businesses, particularly SMEs. Make it easier through Capital Markets Union for small business to get access to capital in the way small business can in the United States. Having a digital single market on a continental scale so that our businesses in Europe are able to operate in the way that American businesses are able to trade online through a clearly understood set of continental-wide rules. That's the way forward. And if we can show we're delivering results in terms of jobs and growth, that's the first step. Second step is Europe's got to recognise diversity and difference. You cannot have the same model of political development and integration for a Europe of 28, soon to be, next decade, to 30 plus member states, as you had for 6 Western European countries in the middle 1950s. We're in a different world. And particularly when some countries are in a currency union, others not. When for as far ahead as I can see, there's going to be a significant bloc outside the euro, but full members of the EU. It won't just be us. I know something about the debate in Swedish politics about EU, about euro membership. Denmark, some other countries are not going to come near meeting the conditions for membership anytime soon, even though they wish to do so. So we have to accommodate that difference amongst member states while maintaining things like the single market, the structures for political and foreign policy cooperation that are also important to take advantage of the greater weight that collective action gets in the world today. And it's taking that trick as well as the trick of economic growth and jobs that are the key to dealing with the problem you identified.
Minister, thank you very much. I know this is extremely relevant to the Swedish situation as well, as you understated. This is the second time you are in Sweden as minister. Please come back.
Third.
Okay, well then
Second
I will
time here.
come back very soon, the 4th time as Minister for European Union Affairs in the United Kingdom. We wish you well for the 23rd of June. Welcome back. Thank you.